Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to begin our afternoon programming. We will start with a discussion similar to where we left off, how we can secure the nation through defense innovation. Please join me in welcoming back to the Ash Carter Exchange, Doug Beck, Director of the Defense Innovation Unit, and Mrs. Stephanie Carter. Welcome.
It's my second grilling of the day. It was very exciting. I hope everyone had a nice 15-minute lunch. I didn't get any yet, so now you're standing between me and my lunch. So I'll make this a great session. But Doug, I want to welcome you back. I want to thank you for your friendship to me, to Ash, and Doug had an amazing career, and you can read his bio in the book. And he worked for this lesser-known company out in California called Apple. And I'm guessing life was pretty good, sometimes stressful, but I'm guessing stock was abundant. And he sort of decided, or maybe was cajoled by Ash to take over DIU. And so I want to thank you for doing that. And you're really a great model, and your military service, I know, also is exemplary of the type of person you are. But I really want to thank you off the bat for your friendship and for doing all the wonderful things you do to keep this country safe.
So first of all, Stephanie, I just want to say how great it is to spend some time together, even though we're doing it up on a stage, but it's just good to be together. And also, I mean, if you think about, I do want to thank, obviously, SCSP, the exchange, and really everybody for being here. And if you think about what Secretary Carter started, and where we now are in terms of conversations like this one, it's pretty amazing, and it kind of all goes back to his vision and his leadership in so many ways, both at a macro level and at a very personal level. And so for me, speaking personally, it is just an incredible honor to be sitting up here with you talking about this. So.
Great. Feelings are mutual.
And I got through that without getting all choked up, so I'm pretty proud of myself. We're off to a good start.
Yes. Well, there might be tears after my questions. But first, next year is 10 years since DIU was created, then as DIUX. I know you were present at the creation. And how have you kind of, over that history, seen DIU's mission evolve, and where's it kind of going based on the discussion we have had? And by the way, you can also give a quick blurb on DIU because just for anyone who doesn't know in the room, but where do you see that kind of going, given every panel up here has talked about this really inseparable relationship now between innovation and our national security?
Yeah, so I mean, that really is what the vision that I was talking about that Secretary Carter really brought to bear on this from the beginning. He was truly prescient in seeing that there was no way that we could meet the strategic imperatives facing the United States to secure the free and open international system, to meet the challenges that were already on the horizon with the PRC and elsewhere, unless we were able to fully harness the power of the commercial tech universe, that the pace of innovation had flipped so that world was advancing new technology at a dramatically faster rate in order to meet the relentless demands of billions of consumers around the world and the enterprises that serve them than ever could be generated solely in our bespoke, defense-only kind of pathways. And so we needed both of those things. And so as you said, I kind of had a seat kind of at the origin, first as a civilian advisor and then with my reserve hat on. And at the beginning, the first step of DIU then X was really about building a bridge kind of at all between these two worlds. Because, and the metric was how many meetings could we have, would anybody show up, and did anybody see any value in being there from either side? And the answer very frequently was, no. They won't show up or they didn't see any value in being there anyway. And that was probably the first year or so. And then it quickly transitioned to the second iteration of DIU, what I like to call DIU 2.0, which was about proving that you could take real military problems, real commercially derived technology, not commercial as might not be straight off the shelf, but commercially derived technology, apply that technology to solve those problems, use authorities that we already had on the books from Congress and had for many years but didn't have a clue how to use, and get prototypes into the hands of the warfighter that met those needs and do it within weeks or months as opposed to 5 or 10 years, which was revolutionary at the time. And now we've done it a ton of times. Sometimes at DIU, a ton of times at other innovation entities that have spun up around the department. And that's fantastic, but it's not good enough because what it doesn't do is meet that original need, which is why, can I say Ash on the stage?
Yeah.
Okay, why Ash first came up with this idea in the first place, right? Which is that in order to meet that strategic imperative, we've got to first take that capability we've built and focus it on those most critical operational capability gaps that allow us to deter major conflict or win if we are forced to fight. And then we've got to do the hard work with the rest of the department of scaling that capability so it actually delivers that strategic impact. Because a prototype doesn't deliver strategic impact. And so those two things are what DIU 3.0 is all about. That's why Secretary Austin elevated DIU back to something a lot more what Ash's original vision was, and it's why Congress then followed up with a bunch of legal authorities. First of all, putting that fact in law, and as well as a whole bunch of authorities to execute against some of what we're now doing, and then showed up with some money to help, which is about $1 billion, which is just still kind of like the tip of the oyster. That's about helping to catalyze 10 or 50 times that much across the department. That's really what we're after now, and that's where things have to go next. It's all about delivering that capability at scale on what matters most.
Yeah. I mean, on that scale point, other places in the Pentagon, in the services, have kind of also sort of borrowed from this model and seen the value in innovation. And then also, interestingly, I mean, some of the conversations we're having right now are, kind of lack of access to things that are not really that innovative, right? We're talking about raw materials and shortages of kind of, old style missiles, et cetera. How do you guys work together? Do you work together? How do you guys work together? And then, have you kind of had any, kind of more holistic conversation with the Office of Strategic Capital that's looking at some of those longer term
funding pieces as well.
Yeah, funding pieces.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the kind of all those innovation entities. First of all, I think this is a good thing. It's a reflection of the revolution that Ash started.
Yeah.
Which is that now that goodness is all over the place, and there are actually at last count about 267 organizations across the Department of Defense that self-identify as an innovation entity, ranging from substantial scale all the way down to individual unit level. And that's great news, but it also could be pretty confusing because if you're a big company, like when I was at Apple, it was kind of confusing when all these different parts of the department would kind of show up to talk to us. Well, if you're a small company of 10 or 15 people and you've got 20 different organizations showing up saying, hi, I'm the Department of Defense and I'm here with the demand, it's pretty hard to pick what matters and why. And so that's one of the things that we've actually spent a lot of time on, kind of a core part of our strategy, and some of the new authorities we've gotten in Congress to help to catalyze all that into a more cohesive community of impact. And so we've started something called the Defense Innovation Community of Entities, where we basically get the core group of, it's more like 25 or 30 organizations, OSC's part of that, together to say, okay, how do we work together to get after them? We chair that from DIU. And that's all about, first of all, it's about knocking dysenergy out of place, like basic stuff like putting, CRM in place so we don't trip all over each other.
Yeah.
But it's also about, and in some cases about working together actively. So how do we take projects, say AFWorks or somebody may have started, and maybe we provide some additional funding from DIU so we can make that thing faster and also more joint.
Yeah.
But it's really importantly about working together to identify those gaps, whether they're directly in terms of on-ramp capabilities for the kinds of non-traditional companies, or they're elsewhere in the supply chain where there might be something else that's a problem that we need to help solve. And then identifying the ones that matter the most, prioritizing those, and then leveraging the fact that DIU now chairs the Defense Innovation Working Group for the department, as well as something called the Deputies Innovation Steering Group, which is the deputy and the vice chairman. We set the agenda for that, sit on that. We bring those problems to that group to help break them down. And that's the kind of, that's sort of like how we do things like, I don't know if people are tracking the authority to operate issue, and we've gone from, this is still baby steps, there's a long way to go, but this is the rule that allows you to basically, once you sell your software over here in the department, you might need to go through a whole bunch of new process, be able to sell it over here to over here to over here. It's about flipping the requirement from it's assumed that you can't bring it across the department to now it's assumed that you can, and there needs to be a case made for why you can't. That's a small example, but a really important one. Identifying those barriers that matter the most, or the leverage points are, working together to knock them down is a big part of what we're focused on.
When we talk about, part of DIU 3.0, talking about, scaling, and I'd love you to kind of talk about that on two different fronts. I mean, I think you and I kind of set these up in the questions, and I'm combining them a little bit. One, how do you get the scale, sort of in the Pentagon? How do you start moving that way? But secondly, how are you working with allies, with combatant commands, with, sort of going out to the wider world to scale what you're doing?
Okay, so maybe we break that into a couple of different pieces.
Yeah.
First, maybe let me take it in turn. First, we'll maybe talk about the combatant commands and where that sort of warfighter demand is. Then let's talk about the scaling piece.
Yeah, analyst privilege. You go
Okay,
ahead.
all right. Well, here we go. So, first, kind of starting where that kind of critical demand is, I mentioned that the whole objective here is about being able to focus where we must focus to solve the critical strategic problems by finding the operational capability gaps that we have where technology can help to leapfrog those to move ahead. And that by doing so, we actually make meaningful change. So the metric goes from the old world where it might have been how many meetings can we have, to now the metric is have we made a meaningful difference to our ability to deter major conflict when forced to fight. That means we got to have changed our operating plans or forced the adversary to change theirs or both, right? So that's kind of the metric. And that really all starts with understanding the needs at the combatant commander level. And so that's why we've embedded very, very deeply with them. So for example, out in Indo-PACOM, Admiral Paparo's team, on his team, and so he and I are talking constantly, and in his team, embedded there, driving kind of the commercial technology integration for him is a DIU embed, right? Or out in the Security Assistance Group Ukraine, which is the U.S. organization that supports Ukraine, the S&T and commercial tech effectively lead for SAG-U is a DIU embed. And so we're doing that in Indo-PACOM, EUCOM, plus SAG-U, SOCOM, Southcom, CENTCOM, Cybercom, et cetera. And that's about getting to those most critical nodes of warfighter demand, making sure we understand what those needs are, and delivering it. And importantly, that's about needs, not requirements. So in the department, we're used to kind of saying, here's a 300-page requirement to tell you exactly what we need.
Right.
If you think about that, if we had done that with what people thought they wanted in terms of a smartphone back in 2006 or 7, you would not have got an iPhone. You would have like a flip phone with, that played Snake a lot faster and had a toothbrush that popped out the side and it was blue. And that is not what was needed.
Right.
So it's about telling tech what's the problem we need to solve and then working together collaboratively with them involved to solve it. So that's a huge part of what we're doing. The command plans are also critical then to helping figure out how we're going to execute on that, because they own those O plans and execution, working together with the services, which I'm going to come to next. And so in initiatives like Replicator, you go from kind of starting with figuring out what are all the systems we need. Replicator is about delivering capability in a fast period of time. The first Replicator is about attritable autonomous capability for Indo-PACOM. So now in those meetings, Indo-PACOM is leading the discussion about how are we driving to capability, by when, on the time frame we need, right?
Yeah.
What are all the man, train, and equip requirements for that? How are we going to get it done? So the second thing you mentioned was about scale. So should I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to turn this into like speechifying, but
No, I'm
all right.
I'm all in.
Okay,
Go.
so the second thing is really about scale, and that's really about partnership with the services, because the services are what I call the true engines of scale for the department. They're the ones who buy stuff and buy it at scale, and then they're also the ones who do all of what we call the .mil PFP, which is basically figuring out how you actually take something from a bunch of stuff to making sure that the people and the training and all the other policies and everything else are knocked down so that you can actually have capability that does something, right? And that then people like Admiral Paparo and Indo-PACOM have those capabilities to bring to bear. So the partnership with the services is absolutely central. So we've changed our model a lot to really change the dynamic for that partnership. So we're not taking on projects anymore where there's not a pathway to scale with the service.
Okay.
And so that's a discussion where, and by pathway to scale, I don't mean somebody somewhere in the Navy or the Air Force thinks it's a good idea. I mean, like, I've had a conversation at the, secretary or deputy secretary or undersecretary or the chief of staff or vice chief of staff level. It's like, okay, we care about this.
Yeah.
And there's a pathway to scale. And that also leads me to one of the other big changes that Congress has really enabled is people talk a lot about this $1 billion budget that we've been given or entrusted with, which is a big help. What matters almost more is the nature of that funding, which is in that number, there's also a flexibility in funding, which is entirely new and at this point still unique to DIU, where we are legally allowed to go all the way from like the research and early development of something all the way to fielding to an operational unit for the initial fielding. That doesn't mean we're going to go scale something, because that's not what we do. But it does mean we can partner differently with the services, because we can move fast. So for example, with the Army, I'll give you a concrete example in company-level unmanned systems. So the Army Futures Command, General Jim Rainey, they see what's happening in Ukraine and in Gaza and the use of unmanned systems at the tactical level. They write a directed requirement about how are we going to learn from that and get something ourselves out and fielded. We then can work with the Army on prototyping the initial capabilities there, which is the kind of thing we always would have done, which usually will cost maybe a few $1 million to come up with a prototype, and we can do it fast, in some cases with things that are already in the inventory somewhere, or could be. I mean, in the inventory of ideas, not in the inventory of the service. But then what's different is now we can put the, tens of millions, without getting into the specifics, against the initial fielding of that to actual units who can then start testing it, playing with it, learning it, changing their behaviors. And the Army has moved a lot in terms of making that much more dynamic, while the Army is then moving their money and their more flexible funding in the second year to be able to help pick that up and drive it. We may help a bit in the second year. And at the same time, the Army is also working, without getting ahead of the longer term budgets, on how to make sure that's funded in the normal budget cycles out in the third year, which is how budgeting works, sadly. So that if we get this right, from soup all the way to nuts, right, we cross the valley and do it together. That is about partnership to scale.
Yeah. So, I mean, in essence, it sounds like you're trying to sort of create a responsible capital formation system that can take it from ideation to actual deployment.
And do it right. Do it with seamlessly without dropping in the middle. Because the problem in the past would be DIU might come up with a great, with the Army, or somebody in the Army, PEO, somebody, might come up with a great prototype. The Army might even want that, right? But for them to then say, ooh, I like that, I want it, then they put in for budget 2 years later,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And in those 2 years, first of all, 2 years go by, which we don't have.
Right.
Second of all, some companies out there with their prototype looking sadly across the valley at the other side, sniffling as they run out of money and hoping that somebody bridges them across. Well, we have not got this solved, but we are working on these are all tools to help us get there. It's still early. We need to be doing this in 100 places or 1,000 and at much greater scale, but we are beginning to crack that problem.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's really crucial. Obviously, you're talking about working with smaller companies who
That's
I'm
right.
sure have a customer concentration issue.
Exactly.
And, on that point, you did bring up Ukraine, and obviously, you and I have talked about, really the innovation that happens in wartime, right? And so, of course, we're all watching the human tragedy of what's going on in Ukraine. We are all watching, the serious challenges to the global order. But at the same time, I would suspect that people in your field are watching at the changing nature of war and the innovations that are happening from, this upstart nation, right? What lessons are you guys kind of bringing back? And, how has this elevated a discussion around our traditional defense industrial base and where that might need to go?
Well, I mean, so we could talk about that one all day. Start off by saying we are both through SAG-U as well as in myriad of other ways, including working directly with the Ukrainians and their innovation entity, which they've continued to evolve and kind of grow in scales. They've learned a lot on how to just help them get capability in place fast that they need, learn quickly, and go. There's so much that we are learning, and the whole department is really focused on how we take this learning and kind of, move quickly with it. I think on the kind of, combination of nature of war and also what kind of opportunities are. So first of all, the concept that, hey, commercially derived technology of all kinds, whether it's space-based capability, communications, mesh networks, crowdsourcing of targeting data, autonomous systems of all kinds, now counter-autonomy, I mean, the electronic warfare capabilities, so many of these things are things that are coming from the commercial tech universe, and that the Ukrainians are finding, adopting, and putting in place at enormous speed, sometimes throwing a whole lot of spaghetti at the wall to see kind of what sticks, but learning an enormous amount fast and making it happen, and asymmetrically taking on a much, much larger military and doing things like sinking a whole fleet without having a navy. These are all things that they're learning. So the question of the value of that tech has been kind of asked and answered, right? So to the extent that anybody was wondering, okay, we're done with that whole wondering stage. So I think that's a really big thing that's changed. There's a huge amount of work to say, okay, what lessons can we learn from that? And that's everything from specific technologies of a lot of the kinds we've talked about to in a kind of affirmative, kind of new good ways for us to think about ways that we might be able to leverage technology and move more quickly, to what are some of the new things that are popping up that we're going to have to think very differently about. So, for example, that electronic warfare environment that I talked about changes incredibly quickly. A lot of the kinds of more advanced systems that we thought were pretty advanced aren't going to operate in that world. They're just not going to work. Not working is not so good. And by the way, even if you think they're working, let a few weeks or a month go by, it doesn't work anymore because the pace of change, which means your ability to update, which, by the way, your iPhone does all the time. Hopefully people have it on automatic update. But you're constantly updating because the threat,
18.1, thank you very much.
the threat continues to update all the time, and so you've got to update all the time. That's a new muscle. So there's a ton that we have learned about the need for the tech. There's a ton that we have learned about the changes and what that means and the pace at which we've got to be able to move. We've also learned a lot about how, frankly, sometimes our own somewhat, even with all the hard work of the entire department, really the interagency to get help to the Ukrainians fast, sometimes we, places like DIU, can help them faster just by introducing them to a great company that does something that they need help. So we've done a ton of that, right? And they can go and take that capability and go run with it. We've also learned a lot about the importance of talent. Talent that really understands the tech and understands the warfighting and how you can put those things together. We don't have enough of those people, but the power of that has been enormous. And so we've learned that both from DIU and the rest of our kind of innovation enterprise and how we can help our own team that is then in turn helping the Ukrainians. But we've also learned a lot about where the gaps are, and we've got to generate more talent going forward.
There's, yeah, I mean, it is moving at a stunning pace, and, you know, I think it should be a strong case for our government, for our industrial base, and for our innovation, you know, industry to really, you know, we'll get onto this, but you and I talked about
move at scale.
You know, and JFK's great quote, since we're down the street, you know, we gotta fix the roof while the sun's shining.
Yeah. Can I actually hit one other thing from Ukraine? It's sort of a big not yet. So I was thinking there's all these big yeses of what we learned. There's a huge not yet, which is not yet at scale. So we're not even yet at the scale that they need to do what they're doing. They've generated an incredible amount of scale, making many thousands of unmanned systems, where we're like working really hard as a whole department to get after a few thousand in a year. They're doing like many thousands or more every month. But none of us in this whole innovation enterprise are yet at the scale that we need to be supporting their needs, much less the kinds of needs that we have in order to effectively deter Russia, deter China, fight those wars. So at the same time that some of these great stories I've mentioned of how commercial tech is making a difference, some of those companies have had to let people go because they don't have the scale yet while they're simultaneously doing that. It's because the scale is not there. We don't yet have the flywheel built to the level that we need to.
On that, well, I'm going to ask you one more question first with our remaining time, but
I know I saw that the extra lunchtime came out of our time together.
I know,
so
I know.
You might just call an audible because it is.
What crap?
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, because I think I would be making my amazingly talented stepdaughter's panel late, so I don't want to do that. But when you're kind of having these conversations, and just for people in the room that don't, and I presume people do, but I'm just saying it, our combatant commanders are actually the ones in the chain of command. They are assigned by an area of responsibility. So we have one in Europe, we have one in the Pacific Command, we have one in AFRICOM, et cetera. And that is actually where any type of command would go, from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant command out to our actual warfighters. So just so people understand that when Doug says he's embedded with them, that he's really close. This is not people that are doing the advice for the White House. What would be maybe one or two areas of kind of a gap that you have heard in these conversations that would surprise people here? You know, I mean, we're talking about all the big technologies in this conference, right? We're talking about quantum, we're talking about AI. You know, is there something that, you know, you've kind of identified a technology need that would have been sort of non-obvious, or that we're not talking about?
So, okay, I'll give two thoughts. The first one is connected to something we're talking about a lot. So first of all, the pace of technological change across all kinds of areas, I'm very, very excited about. I love all of my technology children equally. Whether it's in AI or or all the changes in quantum and what that means for position navigation and timing, for what's happening in space, biotech, which we're going to be talking about shortly, and autonomy and energy, so all over the place. The two things that I maybe would hit on. One is we're spending an enormous amount of time right now talking about the unbelievable revolution in artificial intelligence and machine learning and what that means for the world. And that's critical. We're talking about the development of massive foundational models and the both opportunity and risks that creates, and also just the crazy needs for power and compute, or I guess compute and power, in order to meet that. We are spending a lot of time talking about that, and we should. At the same time, we're not spending nearly enough time talking about distillation, what that means for being able to take some of those capabilities and bring them down to a much, much smaller model that's incredibly powerful, uses a lot less compute, therefore a lot less power, and therefore is something that could be all the way what in my old life we would have said on device. In this world, we might say at the edge, which means embedded in an autonomous system, even one that is disconnected completely from the cloud, right, from the net. That is a massively important change, both offensively and for us to think about if the capability implies defensively as well, and one that I don't think we're spending nearly enough time talking about at the same time that we are talking about the frontier of those foundational ones, which, by the way, are central to developing those more distilled models. But that's part of the problem I don't think we're talking enough about. Second thought I have is actually, one of the things I get most excited about is the intersection across all these technologies. So it's when you combine the artificial intelligence with the quantum PNT, with the sensors and capability that might be in new hardware and new autonomous systems, together with the ability to update those things quickly, including over the air, maybe via space, with new technologies that are there. You put all those things together to make incredibly powerful capabilities together. That's why, so for example, I mentioned the replicator initiative. One of the things that we're spending a lot of time on right now, and I'm looking actually over at Dave, who's leading one of the teams who's doing that. Hey, Dave. Dave leads our autonomy team, DIU. So we're in the middle right now of kind of all the critical enablers for all of those systems, which is where you're taking all those incredible hardware systems, combining them with resilient command and control that can operate under very, very difficult electronic warfare environments, combine that with collaborative autonomy that allows multiple individual units to be able to connect with each other and move collaboratively, combined with automatic target recognition, leveraging the very best of AI to be able to understand what something is and what it's not, and not just do that this way, but also do it that way. All of this is super powerful when you put it together with that hardware, so hardware and software, and new capabilities. That's where you deliver actual warfighting impact. And it's very similar for me as you think about, I apologize, I've used a couple of Apple kind of connections here. If you think about like the power of when technology really makes a difference, when you combine that hardware with the software, so hardware all the way back to the chip, with the rest of that hardware all the way to your Face ID or whatever else, together with new software that can take advantage of all of that, from security to speed to user experience, and the services that make that real for somebody. That's when you actually
GPS.
Right. That's when you get kind of what we would have called an experience. For us in the department, that's a capability. Right? And that's about integrating all those things together and doing it with the people who can then go use it.
Ash always used to talk about, and I think we need to in this discussion talk more about capability. We still talk a lot in troops, and you can have a lot of capabilities without a lot of troops. In this new world.
And you still need to have the right kind of troops, knowing how to figure out how to deploy that capability in the right ways. And so these things are symbiotic but changing.
Last, I asked my last panelist this, your friend Steve. I made him king for a day. I am now taking his crown and handing it to you. and you have
It can be an interagency crown. We'll share
yes,
it.
yes, and you have 2 minutes to tell us what what's coming down on your scroll, King, that would, you know, kind of move all the efforts you're doing, would make them faster, would accelerate them, and multiply their impact.
So I get one wish.
You can have.
Okay,
I'm
making two. I'm making two. I'm making 2
minutes.
Okay, I'm making 2. So first, you know, it's not about tons and tons and tons of new authorities. If I could change anything, most of the tools are in our hands, and it's all about this team of Congress, the department, our interagency partners, and critically all our commercial technology partners getting together to go make change happen. So most of the tools are in our hand, but if I could change one big thing, it is our ridiculous budgeting process as a government. I alluded to this earlier, but the concept that we are all right now having very, very, very productive discussions inside the department about what the budget that we're going to submit for 2026 is, down to kind of the level of individual kind of systems, while at the same time we're sitting here and we still don't have a 25 budget, and we likely won't for quite a while, and we're operating under continuing resolution. Let's just translate that to that Apple world I was talking about for a second. Yeah. That's kind of like if we were sitting here right now debating about whether we were going to buy a 2-year-old iPhone in 2 years, right? Which we might then get then, or we might not get for a year later, because actually we're still waiting for the delivery of the ability to actually get the cash to go pick up the 2-year-old iPhone, which is now a 4-year-old iPhone that we asked for 2 years ago. I mean, that's just insane, right, at the pace that technology moves. So number one, if I could, and actually there's 2 parts to number one. If I could change anything, I would change that whole budgeting process so that we're able to move much more quickly. In the meanwhile, I would dramatically expand the number of flexible funding capabilities that we have for the department, and not just at DIU. And I would also get the department and the Congress to be thinking together about portfolios of record, not programs of record, because it shouldn't be. You shouldn't be asking a DIU to say, "Hey, what drone are you going to buy in 2 years?" The whole reason we exist is to buy stuff in 2 years that doesn't exist today. That's like the whole reason we exist. So that's. Can I say asinine up here?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's totally asinine.
Yeah.
We should not do that. Please, if the press is here, like, please help find a different word for that. But that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, we have to be responsible what we're doing, but we do know major areas of technology we're going to need to make investments. So as we increase the transparency and the credibility that we're bringing to how we solve these problems, we need to increase the trust. And this really starts, I think, at a level that may require a president and a Congress to get together and say, hey, we're going to do this different, because we have to, because we don't have time.
Yeah, yeah.
So that, if I could do one thing, it'd be that, and the other one would be all the cultural things everywhere underpin that, because, you know, a lot of people, including Ash Carter, you say, you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and we got to make sure we do that too. So that could be a longer conversation too. I know we're almost out of time. I still have a minute left. Can I?
Yeah. Hello.
I got a sappy
Your
thing
privilege.
I want to say. Okay, so it's my privilege.
Sap away.
Okay, so one of the things you and I were talking about this yesterday, and you were asking me what I kind of had learned, kind of living in all these different worlds, and especially being in this job for a year. And first of all, there's a lot. Like, there are a lot of things I did not know about how impact does and doesn't happen that I've learned, and my team has been wonderful about helping me get there. Maybe 2 big points that I'd make that also tie back to that conversation that you mentioned earlier when you were first introducing me with Ash convincing me to come do this. So the first one is, you know, the most innovative place I've ever worked in my entire life is a Joint Special Operations Task Force downrange. The least innovative place I've ever worked, and that includes BAPL. No offense, Tim, but right?
Yeah.
The least innovative place I've ever worked my entire life is also places that I have seen in my government service. Yeah. And so the difference in those things has to do with the way that we think about risk and how we behave under different flavors of risk. And one of the things I learned serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, I came home with a completely different view of what risk was. And I realized that most of what I'd spent my entire career as a civilian executive thinking of as risk is not risk. It is uncertainty. It's
Yeah.
uncertainty. It's not risk. Risk is risk to mission, risk to force, strategic risk for our nation. That's risk. And so what we've all got to do together is we have got to figure out how to take the right kinds of risk, right? Process risk, financial risk, reputational risk in case we do something and we look stupid. Because actually making mistakes is part of change. It's central to what happens in the Valley, for example.
Yeah.
We've got to take the right kind of risk to avoid taking the wrong kind of risk, transferring that into real risk on the backs of the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, guardians, Marines, Coast Guards, and we're going to have to fight the war if we can't deter it. Or the strategic risk to our nation, which in some ways could be unfathomable if we get this wrong. So that's a change in mindset. And it also leads me to kind of another change of mindset, which is about the concept of duty. So, you know, I kind of joke sometimes that I'm working deployment hours right now. I've definitely not worked this hard since I was in Ramadi. My entire team is working at least that hard, probably harder. And that's actually just fine, because none of us and nobody out here would probably think twice about working around the clock until you drop if you're in a plywood room or a tent or the bowels of a ship somewhere and we were at war. So why wouldn't we work that hard now to deter one?
Yeah.
And that is actually comes back to a conversation that I had with Ash just a few weeks before he passed, where we were talking about this decision about maybe coming and doing this. And I was saying, you know, I'm going to think about whether the time's right, or whether it makes sense, and because my life was pretty good. And he said, Doug, I got one word for you about why you need to do it. You need to do this now. And I was like, what's that, sir? And he said, the word is duty. And it kind of popped out of the phone and splattered all across my face. And I thought about it, and I thought about this a lot in the following weeks and in the weeks just after he passed. And he was right. And that's why I messed up my perfectly good life to come and do this and do it now. And it's why I think all of us, right, all of us across Congress, the department, the rest of the interagency, everybody across the commercial tech sector, large, small, founders, funders, academics, students, and the media, we all got to be part of a team to be thinking about that duty that we have right now to move fast on this, to make a difference while we can. The time is now, and that's on all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much.